Can I really quickly, you can edit this out later, but I'm going to mention how we're at the VPL right now. And outside the booth is the politics and government section, and then the parenting section, and then the relationships section. And here's the thing, I'm an expert in one of those three things. I'm not going to tell you which one.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on June 8th, 2017, and this is episode 38. Politicoast is the podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter where we're at PoliticoastPod, and support the show at patreon.com/Politicoast.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian, and today we have a special guest.
Hi there, Dave Mosgrove.
Thanks for joining us today, Dave.
My pleasure.
We'll have you sort of interject wherever you feel like.
All right.
But first, I want to give a shout-out to the people who've signed up to support us on Patreon. We have, I think, 9 or 10 people, if you count the two of us, because we sort of have to prime the pumps, right? But I want to give a special shout-out to Ryan Gerber, who's our first, quote, ministerial sponsor at $10 a month. And we've also put up a couple patron exclusives on the site. So if you sign up for at least $2 a month, you can listen to our full uncut interviews that we did sort of when the writ was dropped with David Eby and the BC Greens' Ryan Clayton. So those are kind of fun, especially now that one of them might be a minister. Who knows? We still don't know what might happen.
Yeah, he will. He will.
And we've hit our first goal, which was fantastic, so we'll be able to put more ads out there to promote the show and hopefully grow, and if we reach our next goal, we'll do more bonus content. Let's dive into first segment. Who's going to speak for the legislature? We have basically had this entire week to really learn nothing. The only real big news was today that the legislature will be recalled on June 22nd, and at some point after that will come the confidence vote, probably June 29th. But even then, we're kind of still waiting. There's been a lot of back and forths about who will be the speaker. Will anyone step forward to the speaker? You got in trouble for saying you wanted another election.
Well, I mean, I got some feedback. Yeah, I got some letters, some notes from some friends, some tweets from friends and family. I stand by it. You know, it's nice to be in the minority every so often. You know, it's hard to be. I know it's comfortable being in the majority, but it's nice to be right in the minority.
There you go. So it hasn't been a lot of exciting news, but it is in this sort of speculation mode. MLAs were sworn in yesterday and today, and we're just kind of left still speculating. I think it was worth still talking about because we are a BC Politics podcast, and even though there hasn't been big news, we can add to that speculation. So Scott, who do you think is going to come forward, if anyone, to be speaker?
At this moment, really hard to say. I think the NDP might blink first on this one, just because they want to kind of push ahead, and the Liberals are fine running out the clock for a little while longer and hoping some of those fractures form between the Greens and the NDP.
The problem is, though, if the NDP put up a speaker right now, then when it comes down to a confidence vote, you have 43 Liberals, 43 NDP and Greens, and that speaker would side, assuming they weren't partisan, which is its whole separate Twitter conversation.
Yeah.
They'd side with the government and pass the confidence motion, in which case Christy Clark would still be premier when she's kind of already given her defeatist speech.
Yeah, I mean, this is what drove me nuts about this whole thing was, you need the NDP and the Greens to put forward a speaker, presumably the NDP, to topple the government and then to turn around and support the government, which is to say then the Horgan government in a confidence matter, which is dirty pool. I mean, from the outset, the speaker looks like a partisan hack. Now, the Liberals should have put forward a speaker of their own, I think, and maybe they still will for Clark's speech. Who knows? But the whole thing ends up being a mess from the get-go, and I'm worried that then that cues everyone for a tit-for-tat procedural nastiness for what is to surely be a very short legislative session.
Everyone sort of expects it to be short no matter what. Minority governments aren't known for their longevity.
No, I mean, the average is something like a year and a half. And those are minority governments often that have a little bit more of a room than 43-43. I mean, I've been saying this, lots of people have. Someone's in the bathroom, someone's stuck on a ferry, someone's on a flight that's late, And, maybe Christy Clark says, well, look, why should we do a matching convention? Why should we take someone off the floor because they've got a speaker who's a total partisan hack? And then we do this again in, I'd said 18 months, give or take. I'm thinking maybe it'll be a little bit less than that even.
Yeah, I think the Greens and the NDP want to run it out as long as they can, but it's one of those things where there's just so much uncertainty, and like you said, any little thing can change it and force a confidence vote because it's such a narrow margin. And yeah, I think 18 months would be very optimistic.
Yeah, me too.
6 months is probably more likely on that.
I think the only place I differ is I'm more sympathetic to the idea that the Liberals might actually just cave and bring someone forward. I think it's not in their interest at this point to have another election. I think they almost want to see Horgan try and fail because that gives them a better shot. And I've heard them already say, yeah, we're not putting forward a speaker, but I feel like I read one thing that was like, yeah, if push comes to shove, I'm sure someone will turn up.
Yeah, right. Some MLA out of the kindness of their heart will offer to do it.
And collect $50,000 extra.
Yeah, for a little while anyway. Maybe, the other thing is this. I think the NDP should push for an election now. I think they would come ahead. I actually think look, I'm prognosticating, but, I got the time. Put it this way. So the NDP pushes an election now. Maybe they coordinate with the Greens a little bit, and they run with the narrative of Christy Clark's obstructionist. She wouldn't put a speaker forward. We can't do the business. Look at this great NDP Green deal that quote-unquote 60% of you seem to support when we add the two parties together and do our alchemy. Isn't this great? Don't you love us? And they've got less money. They're broke because they don't. The fundraising rules favor the Liberals, which those rules are bull, but they do. And but you can't buy that narrative. That's a great narrative. Gives them a lot of leverage. Versus 8, 10, 12, 16 months from now, when the NDP looks like they haven't been able to organize a 2-car funeral. And in which case I think they're at a disadvantage. So I'm just, here it is. It is recorded. I think they should do it now. I think if it's 18 months from now, they're in trouble. And I'm not one to say I told you so. But 18 months from now, if the NDP tanks, I'm very much going to be saying, I told you so.
The trick is how does the NDP pull that off without doing it so obviously that they get blamed for triggering the second election?
Not only that, there's also the procedural question of right now the Lieutenant Governor should only be taking advice from the current Premier, which is Christy Clark. If the Leader of the Opposition goes to the Lieutenant Governor, asks for the election, the answer should be no.
Oh yeah, it'll be no. The only way you get an election right now is Clark doesn't offer a speaker, Horgan doesn't offer a speaker, Weaver doesn't offer a speaker, and the LG says, well, I've got no speaker. Clark says, okay, you got to dissolve this thing, and we'll do another election. That would be the cleanest way to it. And look, this isn't a perfect parallel, but there was a broadly similar case in Newfoundland 100 years ago. It was a little bit different. But I think it could be done, and look, I support, by the way, I should say this, I support the NDP Green deal. I think it's a very good deal. I think it's a good agenda. I think it's good for British Columbia, and it's about time. But I think it's the wrong way to do it.
We could go into the questions people were asking on Twitter when we asked, does anyone have a question we could ask you? And they were saying, are you high? Are you just high? Come on.
Why do you hate our summer vacation
Why
so
do
much?
I hate the summer? And what am I on? Am I in the pocket of big polling? Yeah. First of all, I think I'm not in anybody's pocket in the sense that pretty much nobody pays me for most of this stuff. And I know that some listeners are probably thinking, good, which is fine. Look, I'm always sober during working hours, by the way, which I sort of like Tuesday to Thursday, a couple months a year.
There's a good line in the last Silicon Valley, Erlich Bachman was saying, I promise to be the first in at the crack of 10.
Yeah.
And I will stay till 4.
Yeah. Tuesday to Thursday, November to December on alternate years.
Yeah, alternating days.
Yeah,
too.
exactly. I like the summer. I like the sunshine. I like beach reading. I like all the things you people like. I don't particularly want an election this summer. I think it's the right thing to do because I think procedurally these are not just arcane rules that we follow for the sake of following the rules. These are the conventions that we follow to make this thing work. And once you start trading them off for short-term convenience, or because it's politically expedient, or because you're playing partisan realpolitik, you very quickly get into a situation where you've to quote Sir Robert Bolt and Thomas More, you cut a great road through the laws. And what have you done once you've cut a great road through all the laws? There aren't any laws left standing. And that becomes a problem. And I think, you risk getting into a situation kind of like in the United States where it becomes so polarized and so toxic that you get far worse outcomes and nothing done and a lot of gridlock. And, if you trace the history of U.S. polarization, a lot of people look back to the 80s when the Democrats blocked Bork, Reagan's Supreme Court nominee, as the start of this. And then all of a sudden you have Gingrich in the 90s. And now look at it. I want none of that.
On this broader question of conventions, I guess, you're sort of highlighting the reasons not to do it. I guess there is the argument, though, that the conventions we have clearly don't work well in this situation. So is the only out another election, or is there's the argument for another, bending the conventions and finding a way, because conventions should evolve.
Well, the current convention in this case, when you can't actually form a government, is another election. So we do have a convention for this situation, just one that's rarely ever applied.
Yeah, that's my feeling. It was, look, how often has this really been a problem? It's been a problem in Canada kind of twice. So, well, that's not true. It was sort of like this in New Brunswick a few times, and they worked it out. But, I think at the end of the day, when we're looking at how big of a problem this could be if we do it wrong versus, I think, what is the easier solution, which is an election, it makes more sense to have the election. And it would be a minor inconvenience, but as I've been trying to say to people, get over yourselves, for God's sakes. Liberal democracies ask nothing of their citizens. Don't be so... God. You got to pay your taxes, more or less. You've got to obey the law, more or less. And you should vote, even though plenty of you don't. Those are basically the three. And sometimes serve on a jury, but almost never. But not necessarily conscription, right? Conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription.
And we haven't even had that for 70 years.
Exactly. So we basically ask nothing of people. It's, the liberal democracy model is, don't bother anyone else and go do whatever you want. I think it's the least we can do to protect our democratic institutions, to pay attention for 15 minutes for a couple of weeks, pay the $43 million for another election, and pop off to the voting booth, in the middle of July or something on your way to the beach. Get over yourselves. Come on.
Yeah, I more or less agree. And the current impasse we're trying to resolve, it really does seem like fairly small inconvenience, all things considered, and to kind of just completely change the speaker role, which is more or less existed in its current nonpartisan form for 800 some odd years?
The 14th century.
That's a pretty big change to do with a rare inconvenience.
Yeah, and the job's a lot cushier than it used to be. Back in the day, speakers used to literally lose their heads. So, so the folks who are doing it this day, I think, can be excused for wanting to preserve the role as it's evolved. But, the other thing is, it really is, some folks say, well, it's not a big deal, it's just this arcane rule. But it hobbles the speaker's ability, I think, to do his or her job, and it gives MLAs reasons to think, well, this person might be in the bag for the party. Why should I trust them when they're trying to adjudicate the day-to-day proceedings of the House? What if they have to expel a member because someone was particularly naughty? What if they're trying to enforce the rules and MLS say, well, why should I listen to you? You're just an NDP hack. And then the pushback on that is, well, we'll know the difference between when they're acting like a partisan and when they're not. And I call bull on that because, once you think someone's in the bag, good luck thinking anything else.
The only other thing I'd add to that is you're always going to have a slight bit of partisanship because the speaker's human after all and is a party member. But at least with the current convention, there is the expectation that they act in a nonpartisan way. And, you may have those human biases that push them into a less than perfectly nonpartisan way, but they're at least trying to act that way. And people are keeping an eye on them to make sure they're trying to conform to that. And if you completely change the speaker role, that pressure towards being nonpartisan and fair goes away.
Yeah, and maybe just to close off, I'll just, there's a difference between a speaker coming off as a little bit partisan and applying a rule now and again, which is a problem, but whatever, and a speaker routinely voting with the government. which, the speaker rule, basically the convention is they vote to preserve the status quo and to keep debate open. So that means they vote against a bill in the final reading if they have to, which is in the case of a tie, and they vote against amendments. And there's some disagreement as to whether or not they should vote on a confidence matter. So, if it comes down to a tie and the speaker casts the vote to decide whether or not the government falls or lives another day, should they vote to keep the status quo, which is to say with the government, or should they vote against the government, which is what they would do with the bill? There's some disagreement around that. But in this case, the speaker would have to vote with the government every time there's a tie. And you'd imagine it would be pretty often. Or else the legislature gets nothing done. Is that really what we want? I don't think so.
Well, we have the Trudeau government with a majority, and they're barely getting anything done. So sometimes the speaker's not such an issue. I guess.
Well, I tell you, the Liberals are going to do their best to bog this legislature down procedurally, too. That's certainly what I would want to do if I was going to be a nasty partisan about that. And why shouldn't the Liberals be a nasty partisan? Because they're going to be looking at the NDP thinking, well, this is what you're doing with the speaker, so why shouldn't we bog you down in partisan games and procedural games? So, enjoy your functional legislature, everybody.
It'll make the next 18 months or less
Or
interesting.
Or less.
Well, building off of some of the stuff you talked about in terms of how can we make decisions and building better systems, the focus of your work or your academic career is, we'll link to the talk you just did for the BC Human Association, because that's just a nice review of can people make better political decisions. But we thought we'd sort of get you down and just talk about the broader context of being whatever it is you are, that guy on Twitter, I guess.
Yeah, the guy on Twitter.
So we're tentatively titling this segment, Apparently People Care What You Think. Maybe we'll just just ask, how did you get into political science even, and, looking at the questions you decided to look at?
Oh, I actually don't remember. I was trying to think of this the other day. I just always wanted to do it. And when I went to undergrad, I did joint honors in philosophy and poli-sci. I dropped out of co-op because I didn't want to work for the government. Sitting around all day, which is what most of my friends in co-op were doing. I don't mean that civil servants work hard, but co-op students from university who go to work for the government often have a lot of free time on their hands. That was the experience of friends of mine. But, so I don't know, I went away, I got into it, I was studying in Ottawa, I always wanted to write, and then, I was doing my master's one day and I got really sick of reading about deliberative democracy. And so I went over to my bookshelf and I had this book that I bought at Chapters, it was Remainder, it was like $5. And it was a book by Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist, called Looking for Spinoza, Joy, Sorrow, and the Feeling Brain. And in the first few pages, he says that, folks in the humanities and the social sciences should be paying attention to neuroscience and psychology, because understanding how humans behave will help you understand how your institution should be designed. And it will change your politics. I was like, oh my God, have I never thought about this before? And I called my supervisor and I said, geez, Paul, I need to change everything. This is a revolution, and how did I know about this before? And he talked me down, thank God, and said, why don't you just introduce a little bit of this into the work, and then you can work on it more if you do a PhD. And that's how I did it. That was it. And so I did that, and I went away to Korea for a while, taught English, came back and to UBC and did this. And then applied some of the social psychology and saw a little bit of neuroscience into looking at how we make political decisions and what that means. And then, of course, the writing thing just came because I had things to say, and I thought, what are academics doing if they're not plugging back into the broader world by having these conversations with real people day to day, helping them make sense of things, debating, discussing, so on, and giving something back, because let's be honest, it's a pretty good gig when you're a tenured professor, which I'm not, by the way, but, and the other thing is, we're subsidized to the tune of quite a bit by taxpayers and by the state, for one. And I had won some pretty serious awards. Really, this is all publicly available information, but hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of money from the federal government. It was the absolute least I could do to try to give a little bit back to people. Now, you may be thinking, thanks, but no thanks. But some people do enjoy it, so there's that. And then here we are today. So I guess some people do care, which is nice. And some people just really hate my guts. By the way, I don't need Twitter for people to hate me, but it's Twitter. Twitter certainly helps.
Reach a broader audience that way.
Yeah, that's right. You get more, you can have, if to be hated is one thing, but if you really want to be good at being hated, you need to be on Twitter. That should be their tagline. You're welcome on Twitter. I'll send you the bill.
So perhaps you could elaborate a bit more on what your research is.
Yeah. I mean, at the moment, I'm branching out a little bit and looking at a few different projects. One of them, I'm working with some folks as a sort of a casual postdoc on hacking and democracy, on digital threats to democracy.
There's no relevance of that right now.
None at all. No, we're all fine. Don't worry about it, everyone. Just enjoy your bread and circuses. No need to be scared that democracy may fall. And the other is how information flows from experts into the public, perhaps via pundits. I don't know. But my doctoral research was, can we make good political decisions? Yes or no, and if not, why not? And the answer is more or less, we could make good political decisions, which is to say rational decisions that we come up with ourselves, and then when we give reasons for them, they're the true, actual reasons and not total bull, rationalization. But we often don't. And we often don't know that we don't. And the way our world is set up, fast-paced, adversarial, full of money in the wrong places, not asking much from citizens or giving them the resources or time they need or opportunities they need to engage, all of that works against us making good decisions. And so we get a lot of rationalized, hyper-partisan, hack, interest-protecting, tribe-protecting nonsense. And I think that leads to not just a nastier politics than we need to necessarily have, but also a less effective one and certainly a less representative one. Because one of the biggest problems about our bad political decision-making procedurally is that it's the same kind of folks who are getting screwed day in and day out, and it's just incredibly unjust.
So we need to figure out a way to screw different folks now?
If folks are going to be getting screwed, it should be equally. I mean, I would actually think by the time you get to that point, you actually have a nice, equitable pluralism instead of what we have, which is, a sort of pluralism, but where a very small group of basically oligarchs get more than their fair share. And by the way, I should say this, Canada does better than most countries on this. Not, and better than many democracies, and especially better than the United States.
That's a pretty low bar to cross.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I think two of the things that Canada is struggling with right now, or at least one of the major things, is that dwindling media landscape and the fewer media companies. Like, we have 2 national newspaper chains, 3 if you count Torstar.
Yeah.
And there's just fewer and fewer voices, fewer and fewer dollars. Meanwhile, you have less money going into journalism, and so people are looking for quick takes and hot takes and looking for Twitter. Frankly, what's sort of your role almost that you think we could do better in?
Well, I think this is one of the biggest challenges we face as a liberal democracy, And, if you read the Shattered Mirror report that came out a little while ago that looked into this, I talked to some folks who were either experts or participated in that, both some journalists and some academics. And if you think the media landscape in Canada is bad, I have news for you. It is so much worse than you think. And I don't think anybody knows how to fix it. And we're all scrambling. And we also don't know for sure what the effects are going to be. But one thing we do know is that they're going to be negative. And they already are negative to some extent. So, the internet was supposed to be this democratizing force, which would have been great. But as is our wont as human beings, we come up with these tools and then we use them to smash each other over the head. And, that's been true pretty much from the beginning. And in this case, the sort of democratizing force has been offset in large ways by the fracturing of the media landscape, the decline of traditional media, and the siloing of consumption. So that these days, you never have to hear or see or think an unwanted idea or thought. And so you're not challenged, and you can go into your corners. And what does that do? It reinforces biased reasoning. It reinforces motivated reasoning, where you're actually motivated to come up with a conclusion and not necessarily the true or right or well-justified one. The social media encourages nastiness. And what are we going to do about that? We don't know, because it either seems to be government intervention, which potentially comes with its own problems, or oligarchs doing angel investment like Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post, which seems to work, or maybe people will start paying for this stuff again. But it's not like there was ever this golden age of people paying for media. It was well, we'll sell you stuff, and the subscriptions will make some of that money, but it was about driving ad revenues. Well, that's obviously not working anymore. So I don't know what we're going to do. I really don't. People should be paying for this stuff, and they're not. And the consequence of not doing it eventually is going to be really serious, especially as it intersects with other challenges we're facing, like climate change.
Well, that's a clear plug for people to sign up for our Patreon that we just launched.
Yes, you should. If you're listening to this, you can look. If you can't afford $2, don't. If you can, why haven't you? What's wrong with you?
It's about as good as plug we can.
Yeah,
beg for.
it's a little aggressive, but I think.
But more seriously, one of the things I do think is promising, but it's still sort of a big question mark, is, not to be biased, but sort of the growth of podcasts where people can actually sit down and have more longer form conversations about politics and about ideas and try to flesh some of these things out. It's not to say it's perfect, and even, the most successful political podcast in Canada is Canadaland, and they're sort of like struggling. They're growing, but
and they're hit or miss.
No one's really solved this.
Some of that Canadaland stuff is quite good and fills an important gap, and some of it's really garbage. I mean,
That's a favorite take on Twitter for Jesse Brown.
Yeah, and I think, and I have to say, I have mixed feelings about Jesse Brown, but the guy, he owns it, and and he's doing an important job, and he's not perfect, and I expect he'll grow and get better. I certainly hope so. But I do certainly wish him all the best. And it's filling an important role in podcasts. They're certainly filling an important role, and I'm glad to see them out there. But the question is, are we going to fund them properly, and are people going to pay for them, or are they just going to say, well, it's free, why should I bother? I mean, one of my strategies is to set aside X number of dollars every month to pay for media content, for music, for television movies, and for online stuff. And for me, it's an X percentage of my income. And it's like a pretty high percentage of my income because I consume a lot of stuff. And that means I can't pay for everyone and everything. But if everybody did that, and you assume a pretty good distribution of where the money goes, that's not a bad setup. By the way, you should be listening to all these podcasts. There are so many good ones. This one, and by the way, I don't want everyone thinking that I'm a Canadaland hater. I actually think they do a lot of good stuff. So I don't want to. By the way, I don't know Jesse. I've never been on Canadaland or anything, so I've got no interest to declare here. But I like what they're doing, and even when those folks are wrong, or if I'm wrong, or if anyone's wrong, then good. Then you got a chance to get in and say why and have a bit of a debate. And again, to go back to Jesse, he'll engage, which I think is nice. It's part of the reason I do too, as much as I can. It's like at least these folks are out there and they'll talk to you and you can actually have a proper discussion. And I think that's a service. By the way, I should add though, we are human beings and we get tired and sleepy and hungry and our phone batteries die and we get overwhelmed. So, don't expect everything.
There is that sort of information overload level where you can just sort of spend too long on Twitter or Facebook or just clicking through article after article and not actually end up doing anything.
Tell me about it. That's basically my business model right now. I feel compelled to read every note that I get on email, on Facebook, on Twitter, every text, every message across all my platforms. The other day it was 600. And there are folks who get thousands of mentions a day, and there's I'm middle to small. But I feel the need to read it all and to respond to as much as possible. And it's very hard for me to walk away from a discussion or a debate. But it very quickly becomes overwhelming. So as a sort of note to folks who are out there talking to people who have huge followings, for instance, and they think, why doesn't this person ever talk to me? Why don't they engage? Why don't they care? Being on the other side of that, even from my perspective, which is, fairly new and fairly minor, it's overwhelming and very, very difficult, even when you do have the best of intentions. And I'm sort of finding that as I'm growing and doing more and more, and I want to say yes to as much as I can, I'm finding it actually really, really tough and getting tougher, especially when you get into debates where you're just constantly being pounded on, which is fun, as part of the sport for me and whatever. But, you get tired because you're a human being, and there's no one in the world who doesn't get tired.
Do you have advice for you from 2 years ago or someone else who wants to be a media commentator for whatever reason?
Yeah. For one, know what you're getting into. when I was young, I had this idea of what it would be, and now I'm doing it, and it's nothing like it. It's much more aggressive. It's much more exhausting. It's certainly not lucrative, but I enjoy it, and I especially enjoy things like podcasts and radio. And I love writing, but it is nasty, and it doesn't matter who you are. It's going to be nasty. Now, if you're a woman or a person of color, it's probably going to be even nastier than for someone like me who's like a 33-year-old white dude. So
Yeah, you just get picked on for your beard.
Yeah, and I've got like a red beard, and that's like, what are you going to possibly say about that? But when I watch my friends and the folks I admire who are women or persons of color, I mean, they get it so much worse. And this is from people who are going around saying the world is equal, it's a meritocracy. What are you talking about? And these people are living embodiments of how that's not true and how they take all kinds of nasty stuff. So people getting into that shouldn't discourage people from doing it, especially folks who are in it for the right reasons. You really should do it. But the most important thing I found is being nice, being honest, and producing good work. And that might mean that you have to, slog for a little while, but, do that, build the networks, follow up with people and just do a lot of stuff until it hits. And that was how I got started as a writer with Open File, which doesn't exist anymore. But the first paid thing I ever wrote was about the Stanley Cup riots here, and it was a take on what was driving them. And then I just built relationships up from there, and then the Ottawa Citizen took a chance on me in the early days, and then the Globe a little bit, then the Post, and now Maclean's, and that was all just through basically snowballing it. You do a thing, and you meet someone, you meet a guy, you meet a gal, and you build from there. And so if you're, for folks who are just getting started, you got to say yes to a lot of stuff. You got to produce good work in a timely manner. You should be nice and respectful to the folks you're dealing with, not to the people who are trolling you online necessarily. And then keep at it. But again, don't expect that it's going to be some unmitigated state of grace. It's very nasty. And I don't think it's ever going to get any better.
That was a nice
uplifting. But I mean, the question is it at the end of the day worth it? And I think it is. Because I do think, it's a privilege to be heard. It's a privilege that needs to be extended to a lot more people. And so I would quickly interject in sort of in light of the cultural appropriation debate that, quote-unquote, debate that happened recently. I think if you are a person in a position of some privilege and authority, it's, I think, incumbent on you to, help folks up the ladder behind you who may not necessarily be on it otherwise. And I found that, for me, one of the things that I do is this is good. I think this is the best practice, is ask, does the thing I am about to say need to be said? And does it need to be said by me? And if it doesn't need to be said by you, start thinking who else might be able to say this and who isn't saying it. Because, a lot of the research suggests that there are some folks who are more likely to be heard and to put up their hand to be called upon than others, and those folks look a lot like me,
like all of us in this room
exactly,
right now.
Exactly. And so we need to have a much more diverse media landscape, and that means that we need to create space for a more diverse group of folks, and that means that people like me need to know that we need to shut up sometimes and get someone else to do it. And in a lot of cases, it means you have to encourage people. I once got a media request from a journalist that said, we're looking for someone to comment on the upcoming BC election for a story about ridings where only women are running. So there were a few ridings that were female-only candidacies. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, I have some names I can suggest to you. Because, journalists are busy and producers are overwhelmed and they're going to who they know will produce good stuff. But, sometimes the folks that they think of represent a very narrow selection of people in the world. So there are now sites like the experts. The Women Also Know Stuff, and there's a Canadian an experts list. Expertwomen.ca, so check that out as well. And these are valuable resources, and I think to be a little more uplifting about it, I do think if we encourage a much more diverse group, and if we're more willing ourselves to listen and to be open to new ideas and to new conceptions of the world, we might actually produce a better media landscape in terms of the quality of stuff and how receptive we are to it. But it's incumbent on people who are established and privileged to think maybe the world is different than you think it is, and it's certainly different to someone who may not look like you or be in your position, have your history. And basically it boils down to this, like just try to be a little bit empathetic, and then to, don't kick the ladder behind you and pull someone up along with you. That's super rewarding and important.
Well, along that line, while we're giving plugs, I'm going to plug The Broadcast, which is a politics podcast out of Edmonton, which is two women who just talk about
really
women in
good name.
politics. So
that is a fantastic name.
So
on the
they're worth
name
listening
alone,
to.
I'll check that out. But on the name alone, that's really funny.
So you brought up the issue that people might not be as engaged as they could be, and like there's a lot of information out there. This is a hobby for me, and I work a full-time job, and I spend a lot of time reading news stories, opinion pieces, and even I find like I cannot keep up with everything out there. Even like 20% of it is just way above the amount of time I can dedicate to this. So how do we get people to be engaged and actually have the information they need to make informed decisions?
Oh, God. So just a little question. I mean, it's extremely difficult, especially in a landscape where you don't necessarily know where to go to get good information. www.macleans.ca. I'm just kidding. I mean, Maclean's is great, but it's a real a la carte media menu at the moment, and that means that there's a lot of good stuff out there and a lot of bad stuff. And I probably read the news and follow this stuff for 2 hours a day, give or take, maybe sometimes more. That's a luxury that the vast majority of people don't have. So the first thing is, if you're someone just getting into this, my advice is find people you can trust and curate a list of either journalists or commentators or sites that you trust, and try to have a broad sampling from across the political spectrum. Including on the far left and the far, not too far right, I would say, not too far left either, maybe in some cases, and the center and all over, because, you're going to have to cobble together your own understanding of what the world is like, and that requires you to have some anchors that you trust, and then to build up from there. You got to build that base. Also, that's the short run stuff. Don't forget there's also longer run stuff. Keep reading books that are trying to explain the world. Start with the excellent book Why Nations Fail by Acemoglu and Robinson. Then there's all kinds of them. By the way, feel free to write me, and I'm happy to chat about some of my recommendations. Keep your eyes open for the long run stuff too. And the other thing, don't feel, bashful about writing people and asking them questions. That happens to me all the time, and I always answer, even though it takes a while sometimes. But a lot of professors and other folks will do that too, and that's nice. So that's the immediate media landscape thing. But then there's other questions of we need to find ways to provide folks with the resources and the time that they need to do this, especially those who might not have that time. Say they're working a couple of jobs, or they got a big family or whatever, and that's part of the problem. We need to find a way to slow our politics down and give citizens more time. How do you do that? Well, one way to do it is to introduce more things like participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, or citizen juries. These things where you bring a representative or close to representative group of people together, and you give them the resources they need, and you give them the time, and you basically teach them to be citizens around issue questions, and then they go out into the world and become educators. I went to this great event the other day, which was held by some folks who've been on the city task force on electoral reform, and they had been part of this task force, the independent group, and the thing had been disbanded. But they all then went out and became educators because they wanted to keep this going. So they invested their own time and their own resources into bringing groups together to keep these questions alive for the municipal reform options around finance and the electoral system. The woman who ran it had been on the Citizens Assembly. So now what you're doing is you're building these citizens who then become educational nodes, basically, when they go out into the world. Well, we need more of that so that they can, become mentors to people. And the other thing is this, start using community resources. I mean, people just don't know about these things, but they exist. The library is a good place to start, by the way. There's all of these great citizen organizations who are happy to engage. I mean, there are resources out there. So those are some immediate thoughts. But of course, this is all taking place in the broader question of, these macro systems we live in, capitalism, liberal democracy, late modernity, and all this stuff, that really push against good citizenship and good decision making. And the paradox or the trick is the only way to really start to push back against the worst bits of those systems are to empower citizens. But of course, it makes citizen citizen empowerment difficult from the beginning. So it's one of these situations where you've just got to fight back as much as you can. You got to fight for your ability to gain enough resources, enough rights, enough of a voice to be heard, so that you can start to take back a little bit of space, or let's say in some cases get that space in the first place, because maybe you've never had it, to revolutionize how we do politics. And I do think it is revolutionizing it. It's revolutionizing in the sense of it includes citizens who are informed and who have capacity and who can make themselves known to government, because good government only works if there are strong citizens who are able to communicate their preferences to politicians in an equitable way and then hold those politicians to account. And right now we don't have nearly enough of that, and I think it's a huge problem, because to bring it around, it drives a lot of cynicism and apathy and distrust. And once that hit those toxic levels, you, I think, risk, the stability and the future of your democracy. So the stakes are high. So I like to, I like to bring it around to this point to remind people, like, this is a big damn deal.
One of the paradoxes of sort of what you're talking about in sort of about your whole work is around this idea of, like, we want better democracy, but people have this sort of idea that the best democracy is referendums. Like, let's put everything to mass votes. But we kind of know that that's not always a great way, especially on, like, tax policy. It just completely
or
fails.
Transit.
Or transit.
Taxes for transit.
Right, exactly. The worst of both.
So, but is there any place in your mind where referenda can work or are good? Hell, is even voting for representatives a worthwhile practice?
Oh yeah, I mean, my position is this. I believe in representative government. That requires a citizenry who can choose those representatives and hold them to account by choosing different ones if they so please. And I do think there's a place for having referendums, but I think they should be used sparingly. In part because the whole point of having representative democracy is to have folks who do that for you, because you don't have time necessarily to do this. You have a different life. I want more from citizens, but you should still have a private life. There's something between what we have in ancient participatory democracy in Greece that works, I think, as a model. My position is I like having a vote on, obviously for elections, but also for constitutional or quasi-constitutional considerations. So if you were to say, change the Constitution itself, you should have a referendum, because the Constitution fundamentally belongs to the people, not to the politicians. So let the people decide. And you should have a citizens' assembly, in a lot of cases, to come up with recommendations to get it right out of the hands of politicians. And the electoral system, I would call quasi-constitutional at least. The same thing. It belongs to the people, not to politicians who have all kinds of incentives to game the issue and to game the rules. So give it to the people. But the key is you also have to provide opportunity and resources so that people can make better decisions, which means lots of time, lots of money, lots of information, lots of education, all of that stuff. Because citizens have phenomenal capacity. We're not too dumb for democracy. We're not too stupid to vote. We're not too ignorant. But we're encouraged to be all those things by our system, by the fact that we have other things going on. We can't dedicate our attention to it. There's no motivation to be a good citizen. There's a motivation to be good at your job. There's a motivation to raise your family. Well, there's no direct motivation to be a good citizen. People don't see why that matters. Well, when you bring them in and you give them the resources, they do really quickly, and they come up with really good decisions. So, on those things we should. And then leave the rest to the representatives. Part of the problem is this. I don't like how arbitrary the calling of some referendums are. Again, transportation. I mean, the government was too gutless and cynical to raise the taxes we needed to pay for the transit that we need, so they decided to have a vote. Well, it was a disaster. And I don't like that, because it becomes arbitrary. It becomes an out that politicians use because they don't want to make the tough decisions. So hence the need, I think, for a very clear rule about when to call these things and when not to. But when you do have to call one, it's a great opportunity for a civic capacity building.
So we're assuming the government we may be getting lasts until October 2018, we may actually be getting another referendum on electoral reform. So you're more or less happy with that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I've come around on that quite a bit. I advocated for one federally on electoral reform in 2015. I thought we should have a citizens' assembly to come up with the idea, and then a referendum to approve it, basically. I think I would love to have another citizens' assembly now, not just because you'd come up with a good recommendation. I know a lot of people say, well, why don't you just use the one from 2004, 2005? But it's also a great opportunity to build civic capacity and to educate people about this. Plus, the electorate has changed a lot, by the way, in 13 years, whatever it's been. So I don't think it's entirely fair to use it again. But say you can't have one because you're pressed for time. Some citizen jury, some version of it, some sped up version would be good. But if you really, really can't, although I think that's a mistake, then you need to put a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of door knocking into getting this right. I do think a vote is important. That said, I think there's a good argument for having one before, but it would also be perfectly reasonable to have one after you've had this system for an election cycle or two. That's also a legitimate way of doing it, I think. But it seems the compromise will be the vote in the municipal elections in 2018. I would caution this. There needs to be very, very clear rules about what sort of majority you need. I think 50% plus one is fair in a certain number of districts. Or in this case, it'd be a little trickier because it's a municipal thing, but you divide however you want to divide it. And there needs to be a turnout threshold established ahead of time. Maybe you don't want a threshold. Maybe you do. But that needs to be made clear right off the bat because there was a vote in PEI that said yes just recently. And then the Premier said, it was never binding, but the Premier said, well, it wasn't high enough turnout to give us a clear indication. He never said that before. That sows a lot of distrust. And
so we need a Clarity Act that's actually clear.
Yes, we do. Oh, it'd be great. I mean, we can do a whole thing with the Clarity Act. I generally think I generally support it, which is, but the problem is that, people to trust the process, people need to know going in what the rules are very clearly. And the sort of, the referendum in 2005, for instance, set a 60% threshold to get a single transferable vote. We had 57.7% of people vote yes. That's huge. People never vote like that in a referendum on the yes side, and yet here we had it, and then they didn't get it. I think that made a lot of people feel cynical because they thought that, and they knew what the rules were ahead, but they thought that 60% was a little bit arbitrary and unreasonable. There's already a status quo bias around the electoral system. This was just, on steroids.
You mentioned referendums for constitutional issues, and we just had the province of Quebec raise the prospect of opening up the Constitution. Do you have any thoughts on that, or whether or not we're likely to end up in another disaster like
I can imagine that's just good for you. It's just work and more column space to write, and people will want your opinion.
Big constitutional crisis will keep you occupied.
It's good for business. Well, maybe if I'm really lucky, I'll get denounced. Like JJ McCullough says he's been denounced by the legislature in Quebec. I'm not really sure if denouncing is the most reasonable way to put that, but his name came up. I think someone brought it up. Maybe if I'm really lucky and really naughty, I'll be also brought up in the National Assembly in Quebec.
Oh, you do work for Maclean, so
I do. Yeah, I mean, I contact. Yeah, so they have
a history.
Yeah, I'm just Laurentian consensus elite. One percenter. No, I'm just look at me. You can't see me right now, but I basically have $30 worth of clothing on. I understand that constitutional politics in Canada is complicated. I think it's a terrible idea. Not because there aren't serious issues, but because as soon as you do it, it's going to be Charlottetown all over again. Everybody's going to want everything. We're going to get nothing done. It's going to potentially tear the country apart, and for no good reason. And this Quebec nonsense about Quebec's not in the Constitution is so irritating. I go back to Chrétien and Trudeau on this. I mean, Quebec is certainly in the Constitution, both legally and in the sense that there were the Liberals had a majority of Quebec MPs at the time. Quebec has used the notwithstanding clause. Quebecers love the charter. René Lévesque was never going to have a bargain in good faith anyway. I have no sympathy for reopening the Constitution, with one exception: Indigenous people. Now, if we really want to talk seriously about opening the Constitution, and we really want to talk seriously about someone having a right to have that reopened, let's talk about Indigenous people. And by the way, Quebec, that's probably not what you want, because now we start to get into questions of why should the Indigenous people in Quebec want to be a part of the province as is. Maybe they want to have a bit hived off for themselves. There's lots of Indigenous land there. ditto in plenty of provinces. You know, I think if anyone has a right to call for it being opened exclusively for them, it's Indigenous peoples. But, you know, when it comes to the provinces and the Constitution, I think it's much better to do what Prime Minister Harper did, go figure, and what, to some extent, Prime Minister Trudeau has been doing, which is to sort of do this more or less quietly, on the side, through deals, through arrangements, and let it evolve, these relationships evolve. I think it's much more productive. It's much less likely to provoke a crisis. And it's a no-brainer. But of course, politicians have a reason to call for the reopening of the Constitution. Let's not pretend they don't have an interest here, right? It's good business in Quebec if you're the Premier of Quebec to call for it being opened. Not good for Canada.
Do you have any sympathy then for sort of Scheer's proposal, which he made during his leadership race, to add property rights to the Constitution, but to do it on a province-by-province basis through bilateral agreements?
Where to even begin with that? I'll make you a deal, Andrew Scheer. We'll open the Constitution for property rights if you include a positive right for individuals to have a home. How about that? That's a good trade-off, right?
You have the property right to a home.
Yeah, how about that? That's nice, right?
Someone made the argument, a guy whose name I can't remember, Professor, I think Osgood a few years ago, that the Charter is actually a pretty conservative document in a lot of ways because it actually sort of closed the door on positive rights, that you didn't have a right to things like a home or to an income or to whatever. You actually, it was negative rights. You had the right to pursue it, basically to be left alone in pursuit of it, but you didn't have the right to actually be given one by the government. You know, I don't really understand the need for this proposal. To me, it seemed like Scheer was sort of pandering. And, you know, but there's the bargain. Open it up for property rights, we'll give people a positive right to a home. How's that? I have a feeling he's not going to say yes. And then a right to, we'll even throw in a right to a dairy cartel. How about that? So people can pay more for milk.
That's a nice way to cleave the Conservative Party.
Yeah, it'd be great. Yeah. Don't even get me started on the dairy cartel. Quebec's really not going to like me after this, I guess. I've attacked the Constitution and the dairy cartel and supply management. That's okay. Yeah, they're not going to know if I'm an NDP or a Liberal or a Red Tory. It's perfect. I transcend partisanship. You know?
Secretly, you're Green.
Secretly, I'm a Green. Is that? Yeah, maybe. Huh? What am I? Feel free to at me with your guesses. I mean, the other thing is, this is funny. I get called all of the names, including partisans for each party. I was just the other day called a conservative for supporting the speaker and arguing for an election. It's like some guy on Twitter was like, conservatives like Andrew Coyne and Emmett McFarlane and Dave Moscrop, they don't care about it. I'm like, wow. And not only
one of those could maybe be considered a conservative.
Well, and if it's Andrew Coyne, he supported the NDP in the last federal election. So people.
The funniest thing is watching the same Andrew Coyne article get resulting in him getting called an NDPer and a far right conservative.
Oh yeah, Andrew. I like a lot of what he does, and I sort of agree with him half the time and disagree with him half the time. But he really has become a sort of Rorschach test for partisan bias, or like the tofu equivalent, just like whatever takes on the flavor of whatever bias you happen to have inside you, and which is great because to me, I think to some extent that sort of indicates that you're not really in the bag for anyone, which I'm not. I've voted. I've been open about this. I voted Liberal provincially and federally. I voted the NDP provincially and federally. Between Ontario and British Columbia were the two provinces where I've lived. Inconceivably I could vote Conservative. I haven't because they, in my voting life, haven't put anyone forward that I found palatable. Like a guy like Michael Chong, I could imagine supporting in some circumstances, though, depending on where I was. I vote strategically sometimes, and it's nice to get to pick a winner every so often.
Well, that's a whole debate we'll put over there.
Yeah.
Let's move into a third segment on, I guess, the Trudeau Doctrine. The big news this week of the foreign policy pivot, almost. Maybe I'll let you give us the background on this, Scott, since it's more into your wheelhouse.
So ever since America elected Donald Trump, the Liberals have had a bit of a rude awakening and had to really start to think quite a bit about where the country is going and what it means on the international stage beyond the typical aren't we great because we're Canadian, have all these Canadian values, look at us, which is kind of being Canadian foreign policy to a certain extent, or at least the public face of it. And this week on Tuesday, we have the foreign minister, Christine Freeland, give a big speech, kind of hinting at a big pivot in a much more, I guess, robust and somewhat independent foreign policy. And that was followed up the next day by the big defense review, which promised a lot for the military, which is surprising in of itself, just in Canadian politics and from a Liberal government.
So the Freeland speech really tried to focus on three major things: a new, hard power military approach to Canada's foreign policy, which no one expected from the Liberals. This idea of preserving and strengthening the Western alliance almost without Trump, so looking to Europe and NATO, and I guess even NORAD, which would involve the US. Also, just aggressively pursuing new trade agreements, sort of really going after that, Brexit and Trump abandoning NAFTA kind of thing. We'll push forward on TPP and CETA and any other deal they can dream up that will go through. And so parts of it echo Angela Merkel's sort of, well, we don't have any allies left kind of talk of, well, Britain's doing its weird thing and America's doing its weird thing, but Germany will be a world leader, and Canada, I guess, is maybe trying to position ourselves as friends of Germany.
Yeah, it does seem to be the same sort of, well, we can't take the U.S. role here for granted anymore, but we really kind of like the current setup pretty well, and we want to keep that going, but, everyone else is kind of going to have to start pulling America's weight and trying to fill those gaps and take a more firm and robust and, more hard power position. And, as America kind of slides off of the frontman position in terms of global leadership, Russia's getting more assertive. China's becoming the dominant power in the Eastern Pacific.
Well, we even saw this Saudi Arabia alliance sort of start picking on Qatar and playing all kinds of tensions in politics that I don't really understand in the Middle East, but it's worrying.
It is. But it's worth noting, it's funny. I think the Liberals, the old line is that they sort of campaign on the left and govern on the right. I think it's a little more complicated than that. But the Liberals have a more complicated relationship with military spending, I think, than people often know. In the 70s, Pierre Trudeau spent a whole pile of money on the military. I think at one point it was something like 2.1% of GDP.
The last time we did have, I think, 2% of GDP was... Yeah, it was Mulroney and Trudeau, I think, the last two prime ministers that spent that amount.
And by the time Chrétien came along, we were so broke that they had no choice but to cut the military. So it happened to be the Chrétien Liberals who cut the military, but they cut everything. They cut across the board, some departments in half, right? So they hacked it to the bone. And then it started to creep up. And so I don't think it's entirely inconsistent for the Liberals to push that. And of course, they're facing a very new, as Chrystia Freeland noted, a very new world order, potentially. And of course, for the Liberals, especially with the NDP having, let's just be generous and say, not quite managed to get their affairs in order yet, for the Liberals politically, it's also a good move because you hog a little more of the center-right, and you're not too worried on the left because the alternatives are generally pretty awful and incompetent for the most part. Maybe. We'll see if that comes around, but who knows. So, why not if you're Chrystia Freeland? And we've had a long time concerns about the North as well. Let's not pretend that this doesn't have plenty to do with the North and the changing geopolitics of the North in light of climate change and the opening up of shipping routes with the changes in say, northern passageways.
The spending comes still weird to me, though, at this point in time. I get the sort of idea that if this were 30 years ago, buying a whole bunch more fighter jets and frigates and battleships and submarines and fancy war machines might make sense. But in the sort of increasingly electronic online age, there is some focus on that in this defense review, and I think that's sort of where the future is. Mm-hmm. And with the sort of growth of radicalized cells and the terror threats we face aren't something you can stop with a tank. Yeah. The question of buying tanks becomes almost just are we doing it to just reignite a Cold War with Russia?
Well, I think the tendency to view everything in terms of the last war has definitely kind of reappeared, and kind of that sort of, do we need fighters or do we need ships and submarines anymore? And I think the kind of last decade and a half of kind of low intensity conflicts, mostly dealing with non-state actors, there's definitely a bias that has crept in as a result to kind of focus on those as the conflicts we will have going forward. And, you know, with what's happening with Russia and China, I don't think that's a safe assumption. And, you know, yeah, cyber warfare is going to get a lot more important, but, you know, Russia didn't take Crimea using computers. They had people on the ground with guns doing it. And at the end of the day, you still need to have a man with a rifle physically holding the ground to be able to project that sort of power.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say this is a little, this is outside my area. Most of the stuff I know comes from following people like Stephanie Carvin and Steven Seidman at Carleton and Bill Lagasse. I learned from them and sort of follow mostly what they say. And I mean, I think there is a last war concern, but there also is we don't necessarily know what the future is going to look like, and there are issues around maintaining capabilities. I remember a friend of mine saying, who was a reservist and quite a serious one, saying, if you lose the capability, it's much more difficult, much more expensive to get it back. So there is this sort of need to maintain that capability, which requires equipment and men and women who are being trained in the whole thing. And so, look, I mean, I'm on the left politically, and yet I still vigorously believe that we need robust military spending because the world is a very serious, dangerous, nasty place, and I don't want to be the first one to put my gun down. I mean, I wish we could, but that's just not how it's going to be. And I don't want to be, a crank alarmist, but I don't think it's going to get better anytime soon. I think it's going to get worse. Not just because of the sort of changing global order and the fall of the U.S. potentially as a hegemon and so on, as a sort of stabilizing force, but also, catastrophic weather, mass migration, and climate change, which is going to lead to all kinds of problems we just cannot conceive of yet necessarily, at least certainly not in scale. And it, can't hurt to potentially be ready for what might come from that.
Yeah, I more or less agree with that. And you do bring up a good point about the capabilities. And in the last 5-6 years, we've had a significant degrading of our capabilities. Perhaps the most notable is the Navy, which is barely a blue water Navy anymore. We don't have our own supply ships anymore, which severely limits our ability to kind of operate anywhere far away from our coast or friendly port.
We basically have some canoes built by Red Green back in the 90s, held together by duct tape and
little more than that. The Halifax class, they're still in decent shape, although talking to a buddy of mine who works in fleet maintenance in Esquimalt, they're not as in good shape as everyone would like.
Yeah, right. It reminds me of the dented submarines. So remember that in the 90s? It was like we had sort of bought dented submarines from the British or something.
Oh yeah, the Victorias,
yes.
They're
dry dock now? Is that what
they're sort of in quasi operation, but I want to.
Well, that's nice.
So they don't go underwater.
Well, on one of their first sea trials after years in dry dock, one of them actually ran aground.
Oh wow!
So and the Shikunami was part of that caught fire on its voyage here from Britain. Anyway, in the defense review, one of their main bullet points under the Navy was, quote, operational and modernize the 4 Victoria-class submarines. These are boats we bought back in 2002, 2003, and the fact that we're just getting to get them into operation stage shows how bad our submarine situation is.
In a couple more years, those submarines will be old enough to vote.
Well, they were practically seniors as far as subs go when we bought them. And just one other thing on the Navy is we don't have destroyers anymore, and they had all of our command and control systems in there that needed to do a proper fleet command. And you can sort of get around that with what's on the Halifax frigates, but if you want to command a fleet, you really needed our destroyers, which just hit the end of their useful life, and the superstructures were not seaworthy anymore and had to be retired. And the Canadian surface combatant ships are going to replace both them and the frigates, but they're not going to be online for a few years. And it's that sort of loss of capability that's definitely a concern. It's really good to see the military or the government promising more spending, but we'll have to see if that actually
Oh,
materializes.
there's a lag time, right? There's a pretty serious lag time with these
I think
things.
one of the big criticisms in this plan is most of the spending is sort of backlogged or
After the
backloaded
next
on
election?
Well, it's on a 10-year plan,
Yeah.
and so after
Some
the
of it's on
next
a 20.
election or two,
When did we first talk about getting rid of the Sea Kings? When did that start?
Oh,
that would have been a Chrétien thing.
nope,
You're right.
that
No, it was
was
before.
Mulrooney.
Yeah, it was the
Because-
80s,
Yeah,
wasn't it? Or
it was the
70s?
EH-101s was what Mulrooney had signed the contract for, and then Chrétien cancelled
Yeah,
it, and we
right.
had to pay out a bunch of money
Yeah.
for it, and now we're just getting delivery of the new Cyclones to replace the Sea Kings, but we still have Sea Kings flying right now. So, literally, I was not born when we signed the deal to get the Sea King replacement, and I'm now in the latter half of my 20s, and we don't have them yet. So,
I mean, yeah.
I guess-
the pilots weren't
Yeah,
born
right.
when we started the replacement
Well,
process.
that's a good sign.
I guess my broader question is: are Canadians going to buy into both the sort of Freeland switch and the, Harjit Sajjan foreign policy spending spree? And I think part of it also relates to when Trump got elected, most Canadians were not happy. Like an overwhelming majority of Canadians are not supportive of that kind of politics, and they kind of went, "Why is Trudeau trying to be chummy? Like, why didn't he do this earlier?" It's one of the other questions, I think.
Well, I think part of it is he did kind of want to feel out where Trump was, because there was a lot of uncertainty there, and just jumping right kind of away from the traditional America-focused foreign policy is not the sort of thing you just want to do right as soon as an election happens. You do want to see what sort of relationship you can build with the new president, even one as uncertain as Trump. But as Trump has been less and less reliable, and also as he's facing a lot of internal political problems, there's definitely a tendency to move away from that. And I don't think it was a surprise that this stuff came pretty soon after the NATO summit, where Trump didn't restate America's commitment to Article 5.
And sort of embarrassed himself in front of everywhere. Because it was right after that Angela Merkel gave her standalone speech. But do you think Canadians are going to be supportive of the military spending and this idea of Canada as a hard power rather than sort of the more middle power, soft diplomacy stuff?
There's probably a lot of liberals that woke up last couple of days and kind of didn't really recognize their party in terms of foreign policy, because hearing a liberal government talk about hard power is pretty rare.
Mm-hmm.
It's rare to hear a conservative government talk about it like that. It's very uncommon for the liberals to do it. And reading through the defense review, there was definitely parts of the kind of Trudeau liberals brand peppered throughout it, but
Lots of middle class. Helping the military middle class.
actually more gender issues. Actually,
Okay.
Also, it's supporting those in the tank class and those working hard to join it. Huh? That's right.
Oh, yeah.
Come for the knowledge, stay for the one-liners. Two-liners? I want to get into that really quickly, though. I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which Canadians will just be happy to see the Liberals pounding on the Americans a little bit, right? I mean, there is a long-standing Canadian tradition of really enjoying when a government, whomever it may be, pounds on the U.S. a little bit. I mean, that goes back to John MacDonald, for God's sake. I mean, it really goes back, right?
Well, and Canadians also really liked Obama, and there's been a couple more Trudeau-Obama appearances, or at least recirculating the memes, just to be like, hey, remember when America was cool? We were best friends.
Right.
Let's just pretend that's still the case, and we'll go our own way now.
Yeah, and I think, we have a history of sometimes being closer and sometimes being further away from the United States. If you go way back in Canadian history, the arc of this is not obvious. I mean, obviously there's been, increasing sort of North Americanization to some extent, but if you look at the really long run, there's been plenty of moments there where we're pushing back against that, and it's not a given. And of course, the military is one of those things, but also like NAFTA. We don't know what's going to happen with NAFTA either, and so I do think there's a lot of folks right now who are very skeptical of the U.S. administration and who might not view this move necessarily through the lens of military spending as much as they see it as sort of de-Americanization or at least hedging on the America alliance. And I think a lot of folks are going to enjoy that. Of course, if those folks are on the left, like NDP left, they're not going to enjoy the means. But I think the center and the right will like it. And let's be honest, most Canadians, like it or not, are center-right. That's where they are when we look at the data. That's not where I am. It's not where I may want people to be, but that's the reality. And governments know that, parties know that, and they respect that, and they play off of it.
Well, and you have Scheer take over the Conservative Party and sort of, put it back into at least the Harper position, if not a little bit slightly to the right of that, especially on social issues. And that sort of opens up a bit of space for Trudeau to lean to that side instead of the left he's been.
I think we're
more
going to
famous
have
for.
liberal governments for a little while.
Yeah, and that I think also eases off some skepticism I had when I saw how the budget was going to come out. Is like it's I think only 2.6 billion of the new spending is actually going to happen before the next election, which isn't all that much. But there's a fairly safe chance that it's going to be 2023 at the earliest before the Liberal government's out. We might have a minority government after that, only lasts 18 months or something, but it's
The old Paul Martin model.
but there's this early in the first term of a government, there's a good chance they're going to be able to plan out a little longer on that and carry that on. Now, of course, we'll have to see what happens with the fall fiscal update and the budget 2018 and whether these numbers are actually going to show up there.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, it's hard to prognosticate around elections, and it's really hard if you're looking a decade ahead or, 20 years ahead. But, based on the data we have today, I would say we're looking at sort of like 3 Liberal majorities like the 90s. And that's not, exactly all that surprising given Canadian history, which is, lots of years of Liberals, people revolt and have a couple of years of Conservatives, and then we go back. It's been sort of like that for quite a long time in Canada. There's a reason the Liberals are called the natural governing party. And I don't want to diminish the fact that it's because they kind of sit where most Canadians are. And if you're on the right, far-ish right, or the mid-far right, or on the left, you might not like that. But that's the reality of how this thing is shaken out. And that includes a lot of things like defense spending and hedging with the Americans and the rest of it. And, we're not doing so bad. I mean, I always like to bring it back to this sort of like, in the context of the world, we have a lot of problems in Canada. And some very serious ones, especially around Indigenous people, and things like poverty and savings. No Canadians don't save. We have a lot of debt.
But Dave, imagine if you cared.
If only. What is it these days? Hope. It's hope, but also now it's courage. We were talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
Courage is now one of the things too. Not from the Liberals, but
That's Jagmeet Singh.
Jagmeet Singh. There's courage. There's hope. There's
Love is
hard
always
work.
good.
Yeah, love is all you need. Is that? Have I got them all?
Have we grown the economy from the heart outward?
Oh yeah, I remember that. I think I have to say I was pretty nasty to the Liberals back in 2014, 2015. But as people are becoming, I found pundit classes becoming increasingly more critical of the Liberals, I've actually sort of gone the other way. My friends on the left are going to hate this, but I'm mostly fine with them. I really am. I just, I look around the world, honest to God. I look at the rest of the world. I look at Canada. I look at the country and the nature of where most Canadians are politically, acknowledging that most of them don't have the same preferences that I do. And I still think we need to do better on social justice issues, much better. We do much better on Indigenous issues. But I'm fine with the Liberals. I really am.
And actually, you were talking a bit about how the vast majority of Canadians will probably like this sort of stuff or be more or less okay with it. And there's a couple things in here that I think are probably going to play pretty well. Like we're going to get new fixed-wing search and rescue aircraft, so we're not cannibalizing museum pieces, which has happened to keep the buffaloes in the air.
Wait, really?
Yes.
I didn't know about that.
The production line shut down a long time ago, so there's no one making new parts for them, and they've had to actually take.
So some guy's walking through the War Museum?
Yes. Well, I'm not sure the War Museum, but they have had to cannibalize some museum pieces. And
They go after dark. It's a little bit easier.
and they've
National Gallery?
had to buy spare parts from some African countries that are still flying the Buffalo because they have some extras around. The search and rescue situation's bad. Wow. So there's a lot of kind of the things that even if you don't like the kill people and break things end of the military, there's still a bunch of stuff in here that I think Canadians are going to be supportive of. The Air Force is going to get space debris tracking equipment and new capabilities. The Army's improving their advanced water purification system. So they already have these really cool like reverse osmosis units that you basically put on the back of a truck, drive anywhere, drop them off, and you can provide a whole bunch of clean water from basically any water source. And they're going to get newer, better versions of that.
There's some money in there for supporting veterans and sort of post-service.
Yes,
as
and,
well,
and
which is
some
always
some industrial policy stuff too. But there's a lot of those kind of things that people don't necessarily think about with the military that only come up with disasters and
Right.
search and rescue. That'll be in there.
I have a question for you. So, to what extent is this about being able to respond to disasters, say around weather-related events?
It was mentioned a few times within the defense review, and that's always been one of the things the military's focused on. And you have the DART team, and you have the aid to civil power missions, and the disaster response stuff that has happened in the past. So like the military is definitely aware it's one of their mission profiles, and
probably going to be a bigger one going forward.
Yes, and climate change is highlighted as a potential source, and they're greening the military a bit too, and not just for new uniforms, but like actually.
Interesting.
Yeah, all their new infrastructure is going to be LEED silver at a minimum, and So there's some interesting stuff to do. And actually, speaking of infrastructure, there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be upgraded too. A couple of friends of mine work as construction engineers, and there's some horror stories on some of the base infrastructure stuff.
I mean, the base, look at the headquarters, for God's sakes. Why are we so cheap?
I think the shorter answer is the left wants social programs and the conservatives want tax cuts. And
right.
neither of those are willing to be set aside for a bigger military or a better funded one.
Yeah, right. I don't get it. I'm a leftist that's pro-military. Should I run for office?
Well,
that
since
seems like a very
You'd
Canadian.
be a Pat Stogren 2.0.
Well,
Never mind.
He just got out, so there's a empty space.
I don't want to fill the Pat Stogren spot. There's no way.
You just have to run against Politics Inc.
There's also a bunch of stuff in there about new cyber warfare capabilities and going a little more offensive. You mentioned that you've done some work on hacking and how that affects stuff. And I realize this is a super complicated question on how to defend against that sort of stuff. But do you have any brief thoughts on the sort of information warfare that's come up recently?
So I'm part of a research team at UBC that's led by Chris Tenove and Mark Warren, and I'm quite junior, so this is quite a bit outside my area. I'm not even at the top ranks of that team. But put it this way, it does seem to be the emerging battlefield. It is a huge problem and probably bigger than most people think. And it involves not just hacking, stealing information, propaganda, fake news, bots, denial of service attack, faking videos, putting Trojan horses on data keys and getting NATO guys to put them in their computer. I mean, it is wide ranging, and I don't think we're geared up for it. I think we need to be asking ourselves a lot of framing questions like, who are we targeting here? Are we worried about foreign powers, non-state actors, end users who aren't updating their software? We saw this with the WannaCry ransomware attack. Who are we really looking at here? And we need to start having a big national conversation about it right now. Let's just put it that way.
Just 2 quick takes today to finish off a slightly longer episode. It's fine. It'll be interesting.
That's great.
At very
Slightly
worst,
longer.
I'll take some interesting bit of this and make it patron only or something. I don't know, but that takes more editing.
See, folks?
So
Incentive.
it's 10 after 8 p.m. here as we're recording, and I say that because the results are still slowly coming out of the UK general election. I watched the 2015 election live or started to, and then realized, you need to be up, it's 4 a.m. now there, and they're still trying to figure out how it's going to shake out, which is absurd. The current forecast for how it will shake out, it will be 321 seats for Conservative, 260 for Labour, 33 for Scottish National Party, 14 for Lib Dems, and then a splattering around the Northern Irish parties, the other sort of...
Is that a bear-hung parliament?
So it takes 326 seats to make a majority out of the 650-seat parliament, except there are 6 seats going to Sinn Féin, who are these Irish anti-monarchists who will refuse to take their seats because they don't want to swear an oath to the Queen.
You gotta admire something about that.
God bless them, right?
Cool.
Say that as a full atheist. So The Conservatives are under a majority, but there's a lot of indication the Democratic Unionist and Ulster Unionist or whatever it is parties, the Northern Irish Unionist parties will side with them. So they should have a working sort of majority that could get around.
You know what they should do? Run the election again. I'm kidding. Don't write me.
At least they don't have to deal with the speaker question, because the
Yeah,
convention in the UK is the speaker just runs as the Speaker of the House in their constituency and is usually unopposed by the other major parties.
I didn't
It's
know
really
that.
weird.
That's very interesting.
Not always. There's some like weird quirks.
Interesting.
But basically, this is fascinating. It's sort of the worst case scenario for May and almost best case scenario for Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
Because she went into this election with like a 20, 30 point lead in the polls and is now coming out with fewer seats. She basically called the snap election to try to get a bigger majority to better do hard Brexit. And now even that might be...
Just days before the negotiation, before, what is it, like 10, 11 days?
10, 11 days, yeah.
Yeah, this is a rule. I saw someone tweet this today. Like, sometimes this doesn't. Lots of times this doesn't work. Calling a majority election when you've got a majority, and you don't need to call the election. And when it doesn't work, boy, does it ever not work. This is one of those. It really did not work for her. But I have to say, we were talking about this earlier. It really does remind people that there is an appetite right now for the Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders type. I really, truly do believe that, and we need to start taking them far more seriously than we have been.
Well, and his poll numbers really started to rise. Like, they were consistently going up through this entire campaign. But it was like, usually people don't read platforms or manifestos,
Yeah.
but when sort of the conservative one came out that had terms, well, it didn't use the term dementia tax, but everyone went, oh, you're going to tax people who are dying for their healthcare costs? That seems cruel.
Mm-hmm.
And people went, oh, conservatives can actually be viciously cruel. And Labour was like, we're going to put Wi-Fi on all the trains and make it free. And everyone's like, that's amazing.
That's a great deal.
And that's just like the trivial kind of thing.
Yeah.
But a lot of it was, in schools, they were like, let's put a VAT on private school, or I guess what they call public schools, or, the elite schools, and use that to fund preschool meals for kids at public school, or I guess state-run schools. Everything sort of came out popular when no one really expected it, because Jeremy Corbyn has spent his entire leadership of the Labour Party fending off knives in his back.
Yeah.
Surviving multiple stab wounds, I guess. And he seems pretty happy today, sort of like John Horgan's been the last couple of weeks. He's got that ridiculous smile.
It's a bit of a pushback against the sort of Blair, Gordon Brown third way, and I think I'd imagine to some extent, looking across the sea at the United States, and I'd imagine there is some inspiration from Bernie Sanders and his campaign in the UK as well. And I mean, look, when you're looking at inequality at levels that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age, I'm talking about the American context, but people are aware of this globally. I'm not surprised. And can we now take seriously some of these ideas? I certainly hope so.
The only other thing that I think is really interesting in this is it's going to be like another, punch for the pollsters. The UK polling industry is really weird, but they're also really good at like giving out more of their data. So I think a lot of their raw vote or their raw data suggested this would be the result, but they were sort of adjusting to fit the last election where young people didn't really show up, older people showed up a lot more, because the real divide they found is age. Like, people under 40 absurdly love Corbyn. Like, it was 70% or something were going to vote Labour in some under 25 categories.
God, this is why, I flip-flopped, quote-unquote, or evolved on mandatory voting. This is one of those reasons, is that we do not get representative electoral outcomes when vast majority of certain groups, like young people, stay home. There's a reason they stay home. And I get they should turn out, they should vote, the election is won by those who turn out, fine. But there's a reason young people are staying home. It's because they feel alienated. They're not apathetic. They feel alienated. They feel like they're outside the system and no one cares about them. That's got to change, because the current governments in a number of countries do not reflect, I think, what you would have if you had full turnout. That's a problem.
Yeah, the only counterpoint I'd have to that is Tony Abbott got elected in a mandatory voting country.
That is true. Although, that has sort of been baked in I think, and the parties have adjusted accordingly. So maybe they would too in Canada, the US, and the UK. But, there's also different political cultures. I wouldn't say the young are universally leftist,
but I would say they're more likely to be leftist in the, say, Canadian context, in the American context, and in the UK context, at least at the moment. Tony Abbott. We can do a whole thing on that someday. And there's a great speaker thing going on in Australia right now that I highly
saw that.
look it up, folks. I don't have time now but look it up. It's very
Show
interesting.
notes.
Yeah. Oh yeah, show notes.
Yeah,
God,
we have this
podcasts are the best. You guys should pay.
But I think it just goes to show that election campaigns really do matter, and what the polls say when the writ drops are not that predictive. And no politician or strategist should feel that confident just because what the polls say before an election's called.
I got something quick to say on that. Actually, remember the election here in BC in 2013. Adrian Dix, that stupid province headline, "This man could kick a dog and still win." The NDP went with a huge lead. Yeah, campaigns do matter. And it's, everyone, especially in the media, they're always looking for a game-changing moment. Is it a debate? Is it a gaffe? Is it an ad? What is it? And the data suggests that there almost never is such a thing as a game-changing moment. There's a great book by a couple of political scientists in the U.S., I think Vavrick and Sides, called The Gamble, that looks at this. And the truth is that, campaigns matter, but don't look for a moment. The thing as a whole matters. Things change over the period of the campaign. So we need to stop our obsession with the debate or the gaffe or the ad and look at the thing as a whole, because it makes a huge difference. It really does matter. But it's not just because no individual moment matters. The whole thing doesn't matter. The whole thing matters a lot.
Yeah, no one's talking about Linda now.
Oh, yeah. I did a whole radio thing about that at 4 in the morning. Because it was for The Current, which is a great show, and which you're already paying for whether you like it or not if you're Canadian. And it was East Coast, so I went into the studio at 4 o'clock. I know. If you can be coherent at 4 o'clock, it's the ultimate test of a pundit.
The drama from the Conservative leadership race is by no means over. The voting issues still kind of linger on in the background, but what we want to talk about right now is the membership list that got shared with the National Firearms Association. Everyone who signed up to vote, including myself, got a mailing from the NAF trying to encourage us, I guess, support gun rights or something, or push back against the Liberals trying to take away our guns.
They're clearly going to make another gun registry. It's
that
just
went
what
so
Liberals
well?
do, right?
The Conservative Party didn't share the list. The suspicion is it was one of the campaigns, and today CBC reported that they are suspecting it was the Truss campaign, and they have been put on notice and are being asked, and the campaign staff who had access to the data is being interviewed about it. So that might be where it's come from. This isn't the final word by any means.
I assume this is probably going to end up another sort of Pierre Poutine situation where a staffer or someone else gets blamed and the leaders plead enough ignorance that they can probably get away with it. I was really hoping it would be Kevin O'Leary's campaign just because it needs more reasons to laugh at it. I know it wasn't going to be, but it just would have been
What if Deepak Oberoi was secretly a gun plant the whole time?
That was his secret mission to...
I like him. He's a
Everyone
hard
likes
guy
him.
not to like.
Yeah, he did a good job running the plucky comic relief role in the campaign.
He did, and he's a substantive, smart guy. I think he gets a bit of a bad deal because he's great. I'm not surprised that a lot of the heat is now falling on noted human thumb Brad Trost. But I mean, what a joke! What a dumb mess whoever did. I would imagine it probably was a staffer. It probably was someone who just, it often is. I know we want to look at the leaders and at the top brass, but for most of the time, they know better.
Yeah, this is the sort of thing that some staffer probably had and saw a quick buck to be made selling the list, and
maybe didn't think it would catch up with him.
Yeah, but what the Conservative Party actually did was they put fake names in the list they distributed to each of the campaigns. So every campaign got a slightly different list with different fake names in it.
Really?
So that's how they've tracked it down to the Truss campaign. Is apparently the National Firearms Association mailed out to one of the fake names that was assigned to the Truss campaign. Yes.
I love that. That's fantastic. That should be a James Bond novel. I'm in the middle of reading the Ian Fleming books right now, and I feel like that could get into one of those.
it'll be the worst one.
I was gonna say,
But I'm pretty
our
sure.
vision of like what it makes a good Bond novel is very different, I think, than most people's.
I
but
guess you only
we
vote
read it.
twice. Conraker.
I guess you could still call it Doctor No.
That
The
refers to
refer-
reproductive choice.
I was going to say
Kelly
referendum.
There you go. We got Kelly. Oh, okay. When I go home, I'm going to take each campaign and write a Bond novel for them. So that could be great bonus content.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, Dave. Maybe just give a shout out to where people can find you. Where are you writing?
Oh yeah. Well, I write for Maclean's, and I'm on the television on Sundays at BC One, and you can find me on Twitter at David_Mosscroft. And you can write me if you can find my email, which is very easy to find. And I try
Because
to
it'll be
respond.
in the show notes.
Oh, it's gonna be so easy to find. Well, I look forward to hearing from so many of you.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And support the show and join the Politicos community at patreon.com/Politicos. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.
I'm gonna get lots of notes now, aren't I? A lot of people are gonna be.
I'm just gonna cut it down to Dave's hot takes and put that out as a Patreon special.
I'm okay with the